The Forgotten Child. Chapter 1. The Invisible Friend. Madison Garcia had always believed that children had vivid imaginations. Her 6-year-old son, Oliver, often spoke of fantastic creatures and magical lands. She didn't think much of it, attributing his tales to the natural flights of fancy that came with childhood. Every parent knew the routine: the dragons that guarded the playground, the princesses trapped in towers, the talking animals who could give sage advice. But when Oliver began talking about a boy named Henry, someone who supposedly lived in their house, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows through the house. Madison was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when Oliver's voice came from the living room. It was a strange, uncharacteristic tone for him, low and serious, as if he was recounting something important. "Mommy, there's a boy in my room." Madison turned off the stove and walked toward him, brushing her hands on a dish towel. "A boy? Oliver, you know there's no one else here but us." Oliver stood by the doorway, his eyes wide, face pale, as though he'd seen something unimaginable. "His name's Henry. He lives in the closet. He says he used to live here a long time ago." Oliver's words tumbled out in a rush, as if trying to convince her of something that felt very real to him. Madison crouched down to his level, her heart giving a small, uncomfortable thump. "Sweetheart, there's no Henry here," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You've just had a bad dream, that's all. Now let's have dinner, okay?" But Oliver didn't seem convinced. He pulled away from her, a look of stubbornness creeping onto his face. "He's real, Mommy," he repeated, his voice insistent. "He talks to me. He says he wants to play with me." The hairs on Madison's neck stood on end. She had heard of imaginary friends, but this felt different. Much different. It was as though Oliver wasn't just speaking of some figment of his imagination. He seemed to believe, wholeheartedly, that this boy named Henry was real. Madison smiled, albeit a bit nervously, and leaned down to kiss Oliver on the forehead. "Okay, love. You just get some rest. I'll check the closet later, all right?" Oliver's eyes followed her every move, but his lips tightened as if he was holding something back. "Henry doesn't like it when you go in the closet," he said quietly. Madison stood still for a moment, her smile faltering. She didn't know how to respond. How could she explain this? Was it a harmless child's imagination, or was there something more? That night, after she tucked Oliver into bed and kissed him goodnight, Madison couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her. She had tried to convince herself it was just a phase, that children often had their little quirks, but as she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, she couldn't ignore the whispering sensation that seemed to follow her. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. At first, Madison dismissed it as the creaking of the old house, settling into its foundation. But as she stood at the doorway of Oliver's room, staring into the dark, her mind couldn't help but wander. She thought about the closet, the one where Oliver had said Henry lived. The closet door was slightly ajar. A small tremor of unease fluttered through her chest as she stepped toward it. She hesitated for a second, feeling irrationally like something, was watching her. She reached for the handle, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. When she pulled the door open, it revealed only a small space. Oliver's clothes hung neatly on hangers, a few shoes scattered below. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the whispering was louder now. Maddeningly so. Madison stepped back, shutting the door with a snap. Her breathing quickened, but she tried to calm herself. There were logical explanations for everything. Drafts, old wood settling, maybe even some odd sound from the house next door. Still, she couldn't shake the chill crawling down her spine. She stayed by Oliver's door for a while longer, making sure he was still sleeping soundly. His chest rose and fell rhythmically under the covers, his small form tucked into the plush blankets. Yet, despite the peaceful scene, the whispers lingered in the air. Eventually, Madison decided to check the house, walking through each room to reassure herself. But as she moved through the darkened hallways, the sense of being watched never left. Every corner seemed to hold something just out of reach, and the silence of the house felt too complete, too suffocating. She stood at the foot of the stairs, staring up at the dark landing. It was then that she realized she wasn't alone in the house. A faint sound echoed from upstairs, like the light padding of footsteps. Madison froze. She strained her ears, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. The air felt heavy, and every instinct told her to go back to bed and pretend like nothing was wrong. But something inside her, compelled her to go upstairs, toward the source of the noise. Her pulse raced as she ascended the staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. The house was old, the stairs were worn, but tonight the sounds seemed amplified, as if the house itself was alive. Reaching the top, Madison paused. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by a faint light from the bathroom. Everything was still, unnaturally so, except for the whispers. They were louder now, closer, almost as if they were coming from behind her. Turning quickly, Madison's breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the dark corner of the hallway, was a small figure. A boy. He was no more than 6 years old, wearing a tattered shirt and faded jeans, his face pale and gaunt. His hair was matted, and his eyes that seemed impossibly wide and dark, stared at her with an unsettling intensity. For a long moment, neither moved. Madison's heart hammered in her chest as the boy took a slow, deliberate step toward her. He didn't speak, but there was a presence about him, the heaviness in the air that made the very walls of the house seem to close in. "Who are you?" Madison whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The boy's lips parted, and though no sound came out, she could swear he was saying something she couldn't hear but felt in her very bones. And then, as if on cue, the whispering stopped. Suddenly, the boy vanished. Madison staggered back, her body shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. She blinked, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But before she could process anything further, Oliver's voice echoed from his room. "Mommy, Henry says you saw him." Oliver called from the darkness. Madison's breath hitched. She turned quickly, her eyes searching the hallway for any sign of the boy, but there was nothing. No figure in the shadows. No footsteps in the distance. Only the door to Oliver's room, slightly cracked open, waiting for her. With trembling legs, she made her way to Oliver's room, trying to gather her thoughts. But as she entered, her eyes locked onto her son's face. Oliver was sitting up in bed now, his wide green eyes fixed on her with unnerving certainty. "Henry says he's been waiting a long time," Oliver whispered softly, almost as if he were reciting something he'd heard from someone else. "He says he used to live here a long time ago, and he doesn't like being forgotten." Madison's heart skipped a beat, and the room seemed to grow colder, darker, as if something deep within the house had awoken. Something ancient. Something forgotten. Chapter 2. The Cold Touch. As days passed, Oliver's conversations with Henry became more frequent. At first, it was just the occasional mention of his friend, who lived in the closet. But soon, the interactions between them seemed to be more than just figments of a child's imagination. Oliver would talk about Henry as though he were real, sitting at the dinner table with them, joining in on games, and even occupying a seat at the family's weekly movie nights. Madison tried to be patient, reminding herself that children had rich imaginations. Henry was just another imaginary friend, a harmless distraction for Oliver's mind. She chuckled nervously when Oliver insisted on setting a place for Henry at dinner, placing an extra bowl of pasta, an extra glass of water, even a napkin on the chair beside him. But there was a growing discomfort within her, an unease that she couldn't quite shake. One night, as she and Oliver sat at the table eating dinner, the topic of Henry came up once again. "Mommy, Henry says you don't like him," Oliver said, his green eyes wide with worry. Madison stopped mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air. "What?" "Sweetheart, I don't dislike Henry," she said, trying to sound casual. "It's just that he's not real. He's just a story in your mind." Oliver's gaze dropped his plate, his small hands pushing his food around, fidgeting with it. "He doesn't like it when you say that," he muttered. "He says you're not nice to him." Madison frowned, forcing a smile. "Henry's just a game. He's not real, love. You don't need to worry about him." Oliver was silent for a moment, staring at the empty chair beside him, where the ghostly presence of Henry had become more familiar. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "He says if you don't believe in him, he'll get mad." A chill ran through Madison. She hesitated, trying to dismiss the thought, but the unease she felt deep in her gut only intensified. She took a deep breath, trying to steer the conversation in another direction. "Well, it's important to believe in real things, sweetheart, not make-believe ones." But as the evening went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching her. She caught fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of her eyes, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. The air in the house seemed colder, heavier, as if the very walls were pressing in on her. Later that evening, after dinner, Madison kissed Oliver goodnight and tucked him into bed. She took a moment to glance into the closet once more, to assure herself that there was nothing there, that Henry was nothing but a figment of Oliver's overactive imagination. But when she looked at the dark space, she couldn't help but feel a prickle of discomfort. The closet door, which had always been slightly ajar, now stood wide open. Madison froze for a moment. She had never left it like that. She was sure of it. But Oliver was already asleep, his chest rising and falling rhythmically beneath the covers, his breathing soft and steady. She shook her head, chalking it up to the lingering unease from earlier, and quickly closed the door, bolting it shut. But that night, something was different. The moment Madison settled into bed, she felt it, a slight, inexplicable coldness, like a breath of ice-cold air skimming her skin. She pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation that seemed to creep along her arms. The room felt too still, too quiet. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a brief moment, she thought she had fallen asleep. But then came the whisper. It was so faint at first, almost imperceptible, that Madison thought she had imagined it. But the longer she lay there, the clearer it became, soft, almost like a breath being exhaled near her ear, followed by words she couldn't quite make out. A chill spread across her skin, and her eyes snapped open, wide with fear. There, at the edge of her bed, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A shadow. It was too dark, too indistinct to make out clearly, but the presence was unmistakable. It loomed at the foot of the bed, hovering just out of the reach of the lamplight, and it was cold. The kind of cold that sank into your bones, that chilled your very soul. Madison tried to sit up, her body frozen in place as the chill intensified. Her throat constricted as she struggled to breathe. Was it just her imagination? Was she just paranoid? She reached for the lamp, her fingers trembling, but before she could switch it on, a soft voice whispered in the air around her. "You don't believe in me," it said. The voice was childlike, but there was an edge to it, a deep, unsettling tone that seemed to come from nowhere. Madison's heart raced as she felt the coldness grow more intense, as if Someone was pressing in on her from all sides. Her skin prickled with a strange, ghostly sensation, as if invisible hands were gently brushing against her arms. She could feel it, an icy touch, light but unmistakable. Her mind screamed, but her body couldn't move. It was like her limbs were frozen, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. And then, a sharp cry from Oliver's room shattered the silence. Mommy! His voice was filled with terror, raw and desperate. Henry's hurting me? Madison bolted out of bed, rushing toward her son's room. She couldn't get to him fast enough, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stumbled through the dark house, each step seeming to take longer than the last. She threw open the door to Oliver's room, and there he was, standing beside his bed, trembling uncontrollably. Mommy, it hurts. Oliver cried, his small body racked with sobs. He held his arm, and when Madison rushed to him, she saw the red marks, like deep bruises, wrapped around his wrist. The skin was raw, as if someone had gripped him tightly. Oliver, what happened? Madison's voice trembled as she knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she examined the marks. Who did this to you? Henry. Henry got mad, Oliver whimpered, his voice a mixture of fear and confusion. He said you don't believe in him, and it made him sad. Madison's heart hammered at her chest, and for the first time since Oliver had first mentioned Henry, she felt a creeping sense of dread that she couldn't ignore. She had thought it was all a game, a harmless part of growing up. But now, as she looked at the bruises on her son's arm, as she felt the cold, ghostly touch still lingering on her skin, she realized something that chilled her to the core. Henry wasn't just a figment of Oliver's imagination. He wasn't just a harmless story. He was real, and he was angry. Madison pulled Oliver into her arms, holding him close, as if trying to protect him from something she didn't fully understand. Her mind raced, searching for answers, for anything that could explain what was happening. But the answers were few and far between, and the questions were endless. Why had Henry been so angry? What did he want? And most terrifying of all, what was it that had made him so angry that he had turned on Oliver? She kissed the top of her son's head, trying to comfort him, though she knew, deep down, that the nightmare had only just begun. That night, as she held her son in her arms, she felt the coldness again, the sensation of icy fingers brushing against her cheek, as though someone was right behind her, watching her every move. She shuddered, but this time, she didn't close her eyes. She couldn't, because she knew, deep down, that the presence was still there. And this time, it wasn't going away. Chapter 3: The Hidden Truth. Determined to put an end to the eerie occurrences that had turned her once peaceful home into a house of dread, Madison knew she had to uncover the truth. For days, she had been trying to convince herself that the strange happenings, the whispers, and the chilling presence of Henry were simply products of her imagination. But as each day passed, it became harder to ignore the overwhelming sense of something unnatural at play. Oliver's constant interaction with the unseen boy, the bruises on his arm, and the coldness that had overtaken their home were undeniable signs that something was horribly wrong. The night before, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Madison had spent hours searching online, hoping to find some explanation for the unsettling presence that seemed to be haunting their home. She had come across old records, a few pieces of local history, but nothing that fully made sense of what was happening. That is, until she stumbled across an old newspaper article buried deep in the archives. It was dated several decades ago. The headline was short and ominous: "Young boy missing from local family home." The article detailed the disappearance of a boy named Henry Dawson, who had lived in the very house that Madison now called home. He was only 8 years old when he vanished without a trace. According to the article, Henry had been the youngest child of the Dawson family, who had moved into the house shortly after it had been built. The boy was last seen playing near the woods behind the house, but after a frantic search, he was never found. There were no witnesses, no signs of foul play, and no indication of where he could have gone. The Dawson family eventually left the town, and the house had stood vacant for years until Madison and her family moved in. But the article didn't end there. There was a cryptic line buried deep in the text, almost as an afterthought. Some claim that Henry Dawson still haunts the place, trapped in the shadows of his home, waiting to be remembered. Madison's breath caught in her throat. Could this be the same Henry? The same boy that Oliver had been speaking to? It seemed impossible, but there were too many coincidences for her to ignore. The missing boy, the strange happenings, the whispers, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. Henry wasn't just an imaginary friend. He was something else, something far more dangerous, far more real than she had ever imagined. Her thoughts raced as she recalled the bruises on Oliver's arm, the cold, ghostly touch that had grazed her own cheek, the whispers that seemed to call out from the closet. She couldn't shake the thought that Henry was trying to communicate something, but she wasn't sure what. Was he angry? Was he seeking attention? Or was there something deeper at play, something darker, more sinister? Her resolve hardened. She couldn't let this go on. Oliver deserved to live in a safe home, free from whatever it was that had latched onto them. She couldn't allow her son to become a pawn in some tragic, forgotten tale of a lost child. Madison knew what she had to do. It was time to face the truth head-on. The next morning, after a fitful night of restless sleep, Madison took Oliver by the hand and left for the local library. She had decided to dig deeper into the history of the house, to find out everything she could about Henry Dawson and the family that had lived there before her. Perhaps there were records, old letters, or even someone still alive who could shed light on the mystery. As Madison entered the library, the smell of old books and dust filled the air, a comforting but heavy scent. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Dawson, strangely enough, the same surname as the boy, watched her from behind the counter, her sharp eyes following Madison's every movement. "Can I help you, dear?" Mrs. Dawson asked in a voice that seemed a bit too knowing. Madison hesitated for a moment. "I'm looking for information on a family that used to live in the old house on Willow Creek Road," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The Dawsons. I think their son, Henry, went missing about 30 years ago." Mrs. Dawson's expression didn't change, but a subtle flicker of recognition passed across her face. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing whether or not to speak. "Henry Dawson," she murmured. "Yes, I remember him. But I'm afraid that's a sad story." Madison leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Dawson glanced around the room, as though making sure no one else was listening. Then, with a soft sigh, she motioned for Madison to follow her to a back room, where older records were kept. The room was dark and filled with musty bookshelves, and the air felt heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. Mrs. Dawson pulled out an old, leather-bound journal and handed it to Madison. "This was Henry's mother's," Mrs. Dawson said softly, her voice tinged with sorrow. "She left it behind when she moved away. It might give you some answers." Madison took the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped through its yellowed pages. It was filled with handwritten entries, some of them seemingly nonsensical, others full of sorrow and despair. It wasn't until she reached the last few pages that she found something that made her blood run cold. The final entry was dated the day before Henry's disappearance. "He's not like other children. I know he isn't. I don't know how to explain it, but I can feel it in my bones. The boy I gave birth to is gone. What remains isn't my Henry. He's cold. And he's angry. I'm afraid of what he's becoming. The darkness in his eyes. I can't bear it. I'm going to leave. I'm going to take my children and leave this house. But I fear it's already too late. Whatever is here, it's too powerful. It's already taken him. Madison's heart stopped. The words seemed to echo in her mind, each syllable sinking deeper into her consciousness. Whatever Henry had become, it was something unnatural, something dark. And it was still here, still clinging to the house, to Oliver, to her. She quickly closed the journal, feeling the weight of its terrible truth pressing down on her chest. Mrs. Dawson's eyes were watching her closely, and for a moment, Madison wondered if the old woman knew more than she was letting on. "What happened to Henry?" Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Dawson's face softened with pity, but there was no warmth in her eyes. The Dawsons never came back after they left. The house was empty for years, abandoned. Some say Henry never left, that he's still here, waiting for someone to remember him, to take him away from the dark place he's trapped in. Madison's stomach churned as the weight of the truth settled in. Henry had never left the house. He had never been found because he had never left the place where he had disappeared. He was still here, still lingering in the shadows, waiting for someone to acknowledge him, to help him move on, or to bring him back to life. She didn't know what Henry wanted, but she knew one thing. He was dangerous. He was no longer the innocent child he once had been. Whatever had happened to him had twisted him into something else, something vengeful, something desperate. With the journal tucked under her arm, Madison returned home, her mind racing with the grim realization that Henry wasn't going to leave them alone. She had to confront him, face whatever darkness had taken root in their house. But as she entered the living room, the unease in her chest only grew. There, standing in the hallway, was Oliver. His green eyes were wide, staring at the closet door. "Mommy, Henry says he's lonely," Oliver murmured, his voice barely audible. "He wants to play forever." Madison clenched her fists, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. This was it. She had to do this now, before Henry's grip on her son grew any stronger. "Oliver," she said, her voice firm, though her heart raced with fear. "We need to say goodbye to Henry." Oliver's lips trembled as he looked at her. "But he doesn't want to leave," he whispered. A gust of icy air rushed through the room, and the closet door creaked open on its own. Madison felt her stomach drop. The door opened wider, revealing nothing but darkness. But she could feel it, the cold presence, the weight of something ancient and malevolent. "Henry," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "It's time to leave." The air grew colder, and she stepped forward, pulling Oliver behind her. She could feel the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in, but she refused to back down. This had to end. And it would end tonight. Chapter 4. The Final Goodbye. That night, as the full moon hung low in the sky, casting a ghostly glow over the house, Madison made a decision. She could no longer let the events unfold as they had, letting Henry's restless spirit torment her son and herself. She had to face the presence that had haunted them, to give it the peace it so desperately needed. Oliver had suffered enough, and she had no intention of allowing him to be caught in the grip of an angry spirit any longer. She spent the hours before nightfall preparing for the ritual, gathering the items she had read about in old books, and praying it would be enough. Madison wasn't a religious woman, but something about the situation felt beyond anything rational. She needed to believe that something, anything, could break the grip Henry had on their home. She needed to believe in the power of words, in the strength of intention. The room where she had been spending most of her time over the past few days was empty now, save for a few scattered items she had placed there for the ritual. Candles, placed in a circle, flickered with the anticipation of the moment. The air felt thick with the weight of everything that had happened, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Oliver, sensing that tonight was different, had agreed to stay in his room, though his face was a mask of uncertainty. Madison didn't want him to witness what was about to unfold, not if it could be avoided. He had already been through so much, too much, really. She knew he would ask questions, as children often did, but she wasn't ready to explain everything. Not yet. The house was eerily quiet as she sat in the middle of the circle, the candles casting long shadows against the walls. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. This was the moment she would face the darkness, confront the spirit that had taken hold of her family. "Henry," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, as if she were speaking directly to him. "I know you are here. I know you've been waiting. I won't leave you to suffer in this place any longer." The wind outside howled as if in response, rattling the windows of the house. Madison's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She repeated her words, louder this time, a quiet strength in her voice. "You are not forgotten, Henry. You are remembered. But you don't have to stay here anymore. It's time for you to go, to find peace." As the last words left her lips, she felt it, a shift in the air. It was subtle at first, the temperature dropping suddenly as a shadow flickered in the candlelight, like the passing of a figure too quick to be seen. But it was there, undeniably present. The room seemed to contract around her, the walls pressing in as if the house itself were holding its breath, awaiting some unseen transformation. Madison gritted her teeth, pushing through the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She didn't know how much longer she could hold her composure, but she couldn't back down now. This was the only chance she had to save her son, to end the torment that had gripped their home for far too long. The shadows swirled around her, thick and oppressive, as if gathering their strength. The temperature continued to drop, and she could see her breath puffing out in front of her, a cloud of frosty air that seemed to hang in the stillness. But she didn't falter. She had made her decision, and she wouldn't let fear control her anymore. "Henry," she said again, her voice steady despite the overwhelming chill. "You've been lost for too long. You've been waiting for someone to remember you, to help you find peace. But it's time to move on. Let go of this place. Let go of your pain." The room seemed to pulse with an invisible energy, the shadows in the corners of the room shifting with a life of their own. Madison's heart raced in her chest, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in a gesture of resolve. She was doing the right thing, wasn't she? She had to be. This wasn't just about her. It was about Henry, about giving him the chance to move on, to escape the darkness that had claimed him all those years ago. And then there was a sound, a soft gasp. Madison's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, looking toward the source of the noise. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift, twisting like something alive. She felt a sudden rush of warmth, a burst of heat that cut through the chilling air. The temperature in the room shifted dramatically, as though the presence of the spirit was ebbing away, as if something unseen was taking a step back, yielding to the power of her words. Oliver's voice came from behind her, breaking the spell. "He's smiling, Mommy," Oliver whispered in awe, his voice filled with wonder. "He's leaving." Madison's breath caught in her throat as she turned to face her son. He stood in the doorway, his small figure silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway. His wide green eyes were filled with something she couldn't quite describe: relief, joy, and maybe even a hint of sadness. For a long moment, Madison stared at her son, trying to process the emotions running through her. She had feared that she would lose him, that she would never be able to protect him from whatever had taken root in their home. But now, seeing the peaceful expression on Oliver's face, she knew something had changed. Something deep and profound had shifted in the house, and the weight that had hung over them for so long had lifted. The oppressive presence that had once filled the house with cold and darkness was gone. The shadows had dissipated, leaving behind only the soft, flickering light of the candles. A warmth filled the room, a feeling of peace that Madison hadn't realized she had been yearning for until it was finally here. As the closet door, which had once been a source of so much fear, shut gently on its own, the house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The silence that followed was profound, comforting and still, as if the house itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. Madison knelt down beside Oliver, pulling him into her arms. For a moment, they simply sat there, holding each other, surrounded by the quiet stillness of the room. The candlelight flickered softly around them, casting long, warm shadows on the walls. The weight of everything that had happened, the fear, the uncertainty, the ghostly presence of Henry, seemed to dissolve, leaving them both with a sense of calm that was almost surreal. "Mommy," Oliver whispered after a long silence. "Henry's not scared anymore." Madison nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "No, sweetheart. He's not scared anymore. He's gone where he belongs now." From that moment on, the house felt different, lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from its walls. The air was no longer thick with the presence of something unseen and angry. The coldness that had once seeped into their bones was gone, replaced with an unspoken peace. Oliver no longer spoke of Henry. There were no more whispers in the night, no more cold touches or bruises on his skin. He went back to being the curious, energetic child he had been before Henry had entered their lives. Madison watched him with a sense of relief, knowing that the nightmare had ended. But sometimes on quiet nights, when the house was still and the world outside was silent, Madison would hear it. A faint laugh, a whisper of a child's voice, far off and distant, as though coming from the very walls themselves. It was gentle, light-hearted, and full of joy, a stark contrast to the fear and darkness that had once filled their home. Madison would smile softly to herself, feeling a bittersweet peace settle in her heart. She knew that Henry had found his way home, and that, for him, was enough. But for her and for Oliver, their lives could finally begin again, free from the weight of the past, free from the shadows of the forgotten child who had, at last, found his peace.